So I start my remarks with what is perhaps a shocking admission. I agree with Julian's thesis that the executive power was indeed the power to execute law. But the thrust of my argument in my own work is that this executive power to execute law was itself quite a robust power. So robust, in fact, that when compared to the residual reading of the clause, especially in light of the reservations and limitations that the residual theorists themselves make, at least the best among them like Mike Ramsey in this room, it doesn't seem to me that much is actually at stake in this debate. It's still important to get things right, of course, and there will be some differences, but I think Julian's opening claim in the paper that it's hard to overstate the consequences of this dispute is quite wrong. So in my commentary, I'd like to do three things within 10 minutes. First, I want to shore up Julian's case by explaining why I agree with the overarching thesis, although I'll push back on a few points. Second, I'll explain why I don't think much is at stake in this debate between the law execution thesis and the residual thesis. And third, I'll end more provocatively with a claim that there is much at stake in the modern debates over executive power, but that the battle lines are not where Julian draws them. Okay, so part one, in my view, Julian is right. The executive power was indeed a single power. It was only the power to execute law. But it seems to me anyway that there is a thin version of this power and a thicker version of it. The thin version is, I think, what Julian articulates in his paper. The executive power is itself entirely defeasible, and Congress can, I suppose, assign specific duties to subordinate officers and insulate them from, say, presidential removal. The thicker version is the one my paper advances. The executive power is the power to execute law, but that power includes incidental, derivative, and component powers necessary to effectively exercise this executive power, including the powers to appoint, to direct, and to remove executive officers. My claim is that this thick understanding of the executive power to carry law into execution is the only reading of Article 2's vesting clause that is consistent with the textual evidence from the framing and ratification, and with post-ratification historical practice. Julian's papers, both of them, do a remarkable job with the textual evidence, which convinces me. I'll point out three minor criticisms of the textual evidence, although, as I said, I do agree with Julian's evidence on this score. First, lots of the textual evidence that Julian amasses is consistent with the idea that law execution is the essential meaning of the executive power, as Sai Prakash has written, but such a power would not necessarily exclude other executive-type powers. Still, at some point, when all the references to the executive power as a function and not an institution are references to law execution, that is rather persuasive evidence that the law execution meaning is the meaning, the complete and total meaning of the executive power. So I do buy that. Second, though, Julian notes that the use of executive powers in the plural seems to have referred to a bundle of law administration powers, like the power to appoint assistances. I'm not sure about that either. At least some state constitutions refer to executive powers, and these seem to have referred to other royal prerogative authorities. One example is the Georgia Constitution of 1777, which provided that the governor may exercise the executive powers of government, save only in the cases of pardons and remissions of fines. The Delaware Constitution of 1776 is similar. Still, this doesn't do much harm, I don't think, because the executive power in the singular, and when used again to refer to the function and not the institution, still always or almost always seems to have referred to the power to execute law. Third, immediately after Blackstone's discussion of the royal powers and authorities, like sending ambassadors and the like, but just before discussing the financial prerogative, Blackstone writes, the preceding chapter considered at large those branches of the king's prerogative which constitute the executive power of the government. Julian explains this away in his earlier Columbia paper, arguing that this must refer to the institution of the executive, because among other things, it includes a veto power in that chapter, which is legislative. But the problem with that is the next chapter is on the financial prerogatives, which also belong to the institution of the executive, so that doesn't seem right. Still, no harm, no foul. Blackstone's use in that chapter was the only use I've been able to find in which the term the executive power seems to have been used in this broader sense, this residual sense. And elsewhere, he actually uses it as the power to execute law. But still, it's worth pointing out that there is some textual evidence going against Julian's claim, even though it does persuade me. But there's much more in support of the law execution thesis that I think is a future project, not this paper, but I'll mention a couple. In my paper, I focus on the Constitutional Convention. Take two examples, one relatively well-known, one less well-known. First, we know the convention's instructions to the Committee of Detail was that the executive would have only the power to execute law and to appoint officers not otherwise provided for. As John Harrison recently wrote, they rejected giving the president all of the executive rights or executive powers of the Confederation Congress. The law execution thesis is consistent with this instruction. The residual thesis requires us to believe the Committee of Detail ignored it. Maybe, maybe not. A second, and what I find more persuasive, the power to erect corporations was specifically rejected in the Constitutional Convention, most likely because the delegates did not want the national government to have this power at all. Yet the power to erect corporations is a prerogative power mentioned in Blackstone. If the residual thesis is right, the conclusion must be that while voting to deny the national government this power, not a single delegate was aware that that power would belong to the president anyway, by virtue of the vesting clause. That just seems to me totally implausible. Okay, that was my support for Julian's thesis. Part 2. Is there really much difference between the law execution thesis and the residual reading? I'm not sure, or at least I don't think so, because the executive power to execute law was quite a robust power, one that seems to have included component powers, the powers to appoint, to direct, oversee, and perhaps remove officers assisting the president in executing the law. If this is right, then I think every, at least domestic separation of powers disputes should come out the same way. Start with removal. In the decision of 1789, Madison argued that the executive power is vested in the president, but there are exceptions. The Constitution says that in appointing to office, the Senate shall be associated with the president. Have we a right to extend this exception, Madison asked? I believe not. Is this consistent with the law execution thesis? Yes, it is. This is not a statement of the residual thesis at all, although it is often believed to be a statement of the residual thesis. The executive power includes the power of appointment. Even Julian's paper accepts that. Madison argues it also includes the power to displace those officers or assistances who are helping in executing the law. Well, what about Julian's two examples at the beginning, seizing steel mills and torturing terrorists? Well, even on the residual reading, the president only has unallocated prerogatives. Well, Congress has the power to provide and maintain fleets and armies and to appropriate for them. And so I think Congress is specifically granted the power to determine how the military shall be supplied and to authorize or not to authorize the seizure of steel mills. What about torturing terrorists? Well, here too, Congress is given the power to regulate and provide rules for the armed forces. So it seems to me that it's up to Congress to authorize torture or not. Can the president torture in the absence of congressional legislation? Maybe, I don't know, but if yes, that'd be because of his commander-in-chief power. It would have nothing to do with a residual vesting of prerogative power. What about foreign affairs? Well, Blackstone described a power to make proclamations as to the manner, time, and circumstance of putting laws into execution as a power that's derivative of the executive power of the laws. Add to that the fact that treaties are the laws of the land that have to be interpreted in order to be executed, and you get the neutrality proclamation. No residual vesting thesis is necessary at all. In fact, Hamilton's residual vesting argument as Pacificus was made in the alternative to this argument. What about the power to set foreign policy? Well, even the more careful of the residual theorists agree that when the president speaks, when the president issues, say, the Monroe Doctrine, that's not an exercise of a power in the constitutional sense. It doesn't bind anyone. Anyone can speak. Tom Cotton, I think, can send a letter to the Ayatollahs. Whether he or anyone else has any constitutional power to make good on what they say is another matter. In short, I agree with Julian that the executive power is the power to execute law, but it seems to me that under the thick conception of that power shared by the founding generation, the result in most separation of powers cases should be the same, although I will admit, I do think this probably means the president has somewhat less power in foreign affairs than is sometimes believed by at least some of the residual thesis. Okay, so let me conclude with a different observation. There is much at stake in the debates over executive power, but I think Julian has drawn the wrong battle lines. The battle lines are not over which reading of the executive power clause are correct. The battle lines are instead, I submit, between originalism and formalism on the one hand, and functionalism and living constitutionalism on the other. A moment's reflection will demonstrate that if the president is above the law, whatever that means, or perhaps more accurately has too much power, it is because a series of functionalist moves made by the Supreme Court over the last century have created a one-way ratchet in favor of more executive power. It is functionalist, not formalist, to maintain that the nation must speak with one voice on the topic of recognition. It's category 2 of Justice Jackson's functionalist tripartite framework that even in the absence of explicit constitutional or statutory authority may nevertheless create the occasion for the exercise of executive action. It is functionalist, not formalist, to argue that whether military action constitutes war, such that Congress has to declare it, is a function of the anticipated nature, scope, and duration of the planned military operation. And of course, it is a functionalist, not a formalist argument, notwithstanding Julian's recent excellent non-delegation paper, that society is too complex today for Congress to be able to make critical policy-making decisions, and therefore broad delegations of power to the executive are justified. And it is finally functionalist, not formalist, to argue that courts must defer to executive interpretations of law because the executive has more institutional competence. If the president is above the law, it is because a functionalist judiciary and academy might have made him so. If it is a restrained executive that we want, I think that maybe it's originalism that we have to look to. Thank you.
I kind of feel like I mostly have agreement to offer, so maybe you've provoked me so much that I've just agreed as a way of circumventing the provocation. So first of all, and I'd say maybe even foremost, I agree quite strongly that the executive power would have been understood to contain a bundle of authorities relating to law execution. And I've gone back and forth on whether to think of that as authorities useful from a functional sense to executing the law versus logically entailed authorities. And I've decided that nothing rides on that, and there's not a single voice in describing that. Anyway, there's no question that they called out as different elements of the executive power: the power to bring into being affirmative projects, the power to coercively prevent people from doing stuff. And it's not unanimous because some people deny it, but man, most people say that appointments is part of the executive power, including in case law. It's fascinating that nobody says removal is, and what we do with that is a question, but I don't think it's an enormous leap to go from suggesting that appointment is part of the executive power to concluding that maybe we ought to think removal is as well. So perhaps we can discuss the details of that back and forth more. I don't want to take too much time right now, but I would agree. And by the way, I would also say that some people treated the judicial power as a subset, as a distinctive subset of the executive power. And I kind of think that was conceptually the right way to talk about it. So I agree with that. I agree strongly that the reference to setting foreign policy or how do we have a foreign policy power is a problem for the law execution thesis, is a red herring. All it involves to announce a doctrine is to say some stuff. Like you can say whatever you want to. I can say the moon is made of green cheese, and unless I have the power to convert my words into the moon turning into green cheese, it doesn't mean anything. And I also especially agree that Youngstown and the Jackson concurrence, I both love it and hate it. And I used to only and unironically love it, and I still think it's a really powerful, profound way to set up the analysis of how we think about the problem of unauthorized versus authorized presidential action. I think it's got enormous value to it, but I think the Jackson-Frankfurter combination of at least how it's been deployed, of acquiescence analysis and what even means acquiescence and the unitary advantages of the executive to say stuff over and over again in ways that get consolidated and bureaucratized in the OLC has just crept in a way that, like actually in some non-trivial ways, threatens real tyranny. So I agree with that, notwithstanding the fact that I'm not an originalist, notwithstanding the fact that I do gravitate towards functionalism. I agree that in this instance, the entailed feature of that structure has been much to the ill of what we accept as the law governing the separation of powers, and especially disputes between the president and Congress. Thank you.